So first of all, Andrew, Leslie, thank you so much for your vote of confidence to come on the first session on the first day on the climate action stage. We wanted to start strong, and we have certainly achieved that objective with you there. So for those of you who don't know our speakers, we have Leslie Johnston, who is the CEO of the Laudes Foundation, and she will say a few words in a minute about what Laudes does, and Andrew Steer, who is the president and CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund. And today's conversation is really going to be revolving around how climate philanthropy can best drive inclusive and meaningful climate solutions. So, climate philanthropy this year, and you're going to check me on my facts here, has been, I think, growing to the highest amount of donation ever, to 12.5 billion. I think a lot of it is attributed to the Bezos Fund, in fact. But it's the biggest contribution ever, I think, to climate action, yet it still represents, I think, 1.5% of all philanthropic donations. So we think that's an interesting point maybe to explore. And most of it, I think, 2/3 comes from the US and Europe as well. So clearly, climate philanthropy must both scale and be effective. It can also channel funding to the regions that are potentially the most vulnerable to climate impact, to the project that maybe are still at the stage of proof of concept. And they can, importantly, contribute to change system. And so in this morning conversation, that's really what I would like to explore. And I will start to maybe turn to you, Leslie, and ask you maybe in a few words to set the scene for our audience, to tell me what are the key areas of focus of the Laudes Foundation, and explain the underlying strategy behind the deployment of capital. And then, Andrew, I'll ask you the same question, and then we'll discuss from them.
Great. Thank you. There we go. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks, Sophie, for the opportunity to be here. So I think maybe I'll start with the bigger picture, because I think what we've been trying to do as Laudes Foundation is really use philanthropic capital to tackle the way that business, industry, and finance steps up to tackle this climate crisis. In fact, we talk about a dual crisis of climate and inequality, and we believe that business can harness its incredible market power to address this, but it doesn't. Because, as we know, the system is broken. The global economic system has incentives and parameters and even guardrails that I think make it difficult for business to step up and do the right thing. So as a foundation, and I think this is where the role of philanthropy can come in, is we can play a role in looking at, first of all, what are the deeply rooted issues that prevent industry from stepping up? And how do we tackle that with the special tools that we have? Because philanthropy is a very specific type of funding. And specifically, we're looking at the fact that in the industry and in the economy, in fact, we're not valuing what's important. You know, value in a way has become devalued. And so philanthropy can play a role. We can help to put better policies in place that change the rules of the system. We can inspire and delight companies on what could be and show them a better way. We can, strengthen the voice of workers and give them agency to stand up for what's right. And those are all the things that I think philanthropy can do. Those are the things at Laudes we've been trying to do, ultimately to nudge and push and pull business to step up and be a force for good.
So would you characterize the kind of funding is more around shifting the system rather than investing into a specific project, or it's a combination of both?
It's absolutely focused on the system. And I think most of the climate funders, and I look to Andrew for inspiration, are looking at the systemic levers. Because, projects will not get us to the transformation we want to see. And by systemic levers, that's when you're starting to look at the really hard stuff. This is changing mindsets, changing rules, shifting power dynamics. And that does not happen overnight. That does not happen in a 250,000 euro project that lasts 3 years. That's actually a long-term commitment that you need long-term funders like philanthropists to focus on.
Great, thank you. Andrew, can you tell us a little bit about the key areas of focus of the fund and the underlying strategy behind the deployment of those projects?
Great, yes, with pleasure. First though, Sophie, thank you for this. Thanks to Kite Insights. In this room, there will be some very important discussions in the next few days, so it's an honor to be here for the very first session.
You're only followed by Boris Johnson, by the way, is coming after.
That's good.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's okay?
So that's why you're all here.
No,
you want seats before Boris comes.
They're all here for you.
Yes. So I have the privilege of leading the Bezos Earth Fund. Jeff Bezos, about 2 years ago, decided to take $10 billion of his own personal money and put it in a fund and say, look, let's spend it down in this decisive decade. Let's not create a foundation that lasts 100 years. Let's really recognize the urgency of the time. And let's aim at two issues that really are the same issue in many ways, climate and nature. And the reason they're the same issue is if you protect nature, you will play a very important role in addressing climate change. And addressing nature will not only help mitigate the problem by sucking down molecules of carbon dioxide through the magic of photosynthesis and creating trees and bushes and crops and soils, all of which need carbon. It's much too valuable a commodity to leave up there in the sky, so to speak. So nature and climate, same thing. But we don't just do the nature side. We do, if you like, industrial decarbonization. We do a lot of work on energy, bringing renewable energy to Africa, working on some of the really exciting new initiatives now, such as decommissioning coal plants in South Africa and Indonesia and so on. So there's a thrilling agenda ahead of us. And just to agree wholeheartedly with my very good friend Leslie, $10 billion sounds like a lot of money. It is a very small amount of money compared to the need, so to speak. So you've got to make every single dollar work. And most philanthropy, and there's nothing wrong with this, most philanthropy has not been very leveraged. In other words, you put money, you support a school. You build a school, $1 in and $1 very good dollar of delivery of school. But wouldn't it be great if you could figure out a way of turning that dollar into $10? Maybe through de-risking some private investment, maybe through flipping policy in the way that Leslie was talking about. So actually, policies change, and my goodness me, we have a new potential trajectory for the entire system, so to speak. So I think all of us are really struggling with this issue of system change. You've done some amazing work on it in Laudes. We sponsor, together with some other institutions, something called the System Change Lab. And what that does is it monitors the 50 to 70 transitions that we need to go through this decade and next. And it asks the question, how close are they to tipping points? And what would it take to get whatever transition is necessary to that tipping point so that change becomes irresistible and unstoppable?
So you're referring to positive tipping points in this case?
I'm referring to positive tipping points, yeah. We try and avoid the other ones.
Yes, which is interesting. And the better you understand the negative one, the better you can influence the positive one. So this intersection between climate and nature that you're focusing on, yes. Do you feel that is well understood by industry, by the key players out there, government? And to what extent you're beyond the initiative you enable, you're also trying to influence how people understand that intersection between climate and nature?
I would say as recently as 2 years ago, it was very poorly understood. And I think the environmental movement, even itself, hadn't really got a narrative that was convincing. I think a lot's changed in the last year. And actually COP27 last year in Glasgow, I think really played an incredibly valuable role in making the story clearer. We're still not there yet, of course. I think the fact that this year we've got both this COP and then next month we have COP15, the biodiversity COP. I think those two are pretty well integrated, even although, quite frankly, I mean, progress is nowhere near where we need to be. But for example, the initiative called 30 by 30, that is to protect 30% of land and water by 2030, that has galvanized quite a lot of interest because it's something you can get your head around. And so countries like, Colombia has just doubled its protected areas. The United States has now signed up to that. 104 countries have now signed up to 30 by 30, and today there's a head of state meeting that we're part of that will try and sort of ramp up enthusiasm for that narrative further.
Great, and I'll come back to what you want to get out of COP later in the conversation, but I'd like to focus a little bit on the tensions. You know, what do we need more of? What is not? What is difficult about philanthropic funding? And I'm thinking about funding system change. It's long and hard. How do you, and yet critical, but how do you couple short-term activities with long-term activities? Can you talk to me a little bit about how you think about demonstrating the impact? Because you probably need to constantly incentivize people to invest in system change. Can you talk about a little bit that tension there, if it is a tension?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely a tension. And I think this is, well, I guess what philanthropy could do well, and I say could do because I think there's a long way for foundations to go in doing this, is to really focus on that longer term. And I mean, this is the challenge we're in because, of course, we are in this cascading crisis moment. We're coming up to, at least in Europe and North America, a cold winter. We have an energy crisis upon us. We have a food crisis. We have a refugee. I mean, there's crisis after crisis. So how on earth do you focus on the longer term?
And am I right to say that those short-term crises can in fact derail your focus on system change as well?
Yes. And that's why before I had mentioned, it's a bit philosophical, but the whole idea of mindsets, rules, and power, that for me, that was kind of a first frame when we set up Laudes in early 2000 around how do you actually create transformational change. And key to that is ideas. And I know it sounds a little bit loosey-goosey, but ideas are important. You know, the ideas of our current system, neoliberal capitalism, are probably not the ideas that are going to move us to the inclusive economy that we want to see, one that values nature and respects people. So we need new ideas, we need new frameworks, we need new economic thinking. You mentioned the Earth for All book earlier in your introduction. That is chock-a-block of new ways to look at our system. And in, I guess, a time of crisis, no one's going to think about that. Policymakers aren't thinking about that. They're thinking about how to reduce the impact of rising inflation on people's pocketbooks. So that's where philanthropy can come in and have that long-term view. And I'd say it's not doing that yet. I think that there's a lot more we could do around the idea side and not be too focused or as focused on short-term action.
Interesting. Andrew, I mean, maybe you want to build on that point, which is linked to there's only 2% of philanthropic funding that is deployed towards climate action. But I also wanted to go specifically to some of the activities that you're funding that I think are aiming to reach some specific communities. And I'd like to ask you how do you ensure that the communities you serve and support have a say on how the money is being deployed? As well, how do you even make sure that they have the capacity to absorb the funding? How do you build the capacity for them to be able to do something really useful long-term with that funding?
Well, both very important and very difficult questions. We've been talking about the need to engage indigenous people for many years now, but it was
which is one of your projects, right?
Well, I think all of us, I hope, in the business of nature are in the business of working with indigenous people. Last year at the COP, there was an announcement from a group of philanthropists to make sure $1 billion would not only be designed to help indigenous people, but would be channeled with them and through them. And so I think there is, I think we're going through a very exciting stage of rethink on this. We shouldn't kid ourselves, it's easy, but certainly there is a depth of discussion and engagement now. And it's an issue not just that, developing and emerging countries are struggling with. It's an issue that the United States, I was up in Canada last month, they're doing incredibly innovative things with the First Nations now. We're supporting the Emerald Edge, which is up there in the northwest coast of British Columbia. And really the program is being led by First Nations. So there are some very exciting opportunities. But at the end of the day, as you say, all of us need to have our capacity built. And for whether it's indigenous people or whether it's its local communities, there needs to be an empowerment. So, for example, today we'll be making an announcement in the high-level segment on restoration in Africa. And the question there is, who actually does the restoration? It's not big companies. It is tens and tens, hundreds of thousands of small farmers and farmers groups and so on. And the question is, how do you get the resources to those people who are on the front line, who know how to do it, but actually maybe don't know how to get access to funding, maybe don't know how to grow their business, small businesses very well. So we're going to be setting up a very serious program with them in a couple of African countries.
May I build on that? Because I think that is such an important comment on where philanthropy can play a role. Because I think that when we talk about, say, rapid decarbonization of the built environment, as an example, 40% of emissions, big one, no one really talks about the communities and the people impacted with such decarbonization. And I think that's where philanthropy comes in, because you can actually bring the voice of the communities. You can make sure their voice is represented. One thing we've been doing around the mandatory human rights due diligence work is making sure that the voice of workers impacted in places like Bangladesh and India are at the table in the negotiations in the EU. And we do that through partners. And philanthropy is really critical for doing that, because if we don't do that, then who will? These workers and communities do not have the opportunity to represent themselves, and they don't necessarily have access. In fact, there's not a single worker or community member here in this audience, and I would even say probably a very limited amount here at the COP conference. So if we really want to create systemic change, we need to think about nothing about us without us, and make sure that those most impacted are at the table.
Great. And I think the Bezos Fund is funding a group of indigenous people coming to COP. Is that right?
Yes.
So are philanthropy organizations sometimes sort of getting together and to say, how do we pool resources together so that we don't all go after I'm sorry, they don't look very comfortable. It was a test whether the stools were good. I think we're going to go for chair on the next. It's fine. Yeah. Anyway, how do philanthropies get together and say, how are we going to divide to conquer, rather than avoiding fragmentation of your intervention? Do you do that? Is that a tension?
I'll start. I think especially for those that don't have the resources of the Bezos Earth Fund, it's very important, and I agree with you, Andrew. I think that, 10 billion is a drop in the bucket when it comes to what's really needed. We need trillions for this fair decarbonization. But I think the good news is that philanthropies are coming together more. Thanks to Climate Works for setting up the Climate Funders Group, I think over a decade ago. There's other funder groups that exist. Some look at economic paradigms, some look at the role of workers and communities. Funders are playing nicely together, but I do think there's still a challenge because as foundations, we are not necessarily held accountable for our results. Depends what jurisdiction you're in, but I do think there's more that could be done to help philanthropy actually be more transparent and accountable. And if we're more accountable as we hold our partners accountable, then hopefully we will be more accountable for collaborating together.
Interesting. Andrew, any thoughts on that?
So I'm relatively new to the world of philanthropy, just a year and a half. But of course, I saw it from the other side when I was running an NGO raising money from philanthropy. I've been actually quite impressed with how philanthropies work together. And by the way, you play a very important role in Laudes in that regard. And if you look at sort of some of the issues, and back to the issue of big money versus small money can be incredibly impactful. In a way, small money can be, be, as you say, Leslie, real ideas. They can be absolutely out front. And then maybe a slightly bigger money comes behind, and then big public money and private money comes behind that, so to speak. And if you look at sort of some of the big changes that are going on, actually modest amounts of philanthropy have played a big role. One of the questions it would be interesting actually to ask Boris Johnson would be, he decided, look, we need to get rid of the internal combustion engine. And people were saying, well, how about 2040 or 2035? He said, no, why don't we do it by 2030? That announcement was based upon a lot of analysis, not only the government officials have done, but an entire sort of effort that philanthropy and NGOs had been working on to demonstrate it was possible, so to speak. And by the way, I mean, that kind of leadership, getting out of the comfort zone and saying, we are going to do something which all of the critics will say is going to cost us, it's going to drag down our economy, it's going to make us uncompetitive, it's going to throw people out of work. Do it anyway, and you will be surprised that actually it opens up new industries, it opens up new possibilities, it shifts expectation, it drives new technologies, it brings confidence. So well done, Boris, on that. But philanthropy played a very important role. It was relatively small amounts of money.
That's back to your point about powering bold ideas. You know, those ideas from reputable philanthropists can really change a mindset. So I promised you missed the introduction, Andrew, but to bring a bit of heart in our discussion. So I'm just going to ask you each, in your role, you know, you're making decision every day that has a potential to truly transform people's life. And could you share maybe a story that has touched you recently of a decision you've made, an investment you've made that made you feel that your job was really worthwhile?
Well, I think part of maybe the irony of getting more strategic in philanthropy is you get further away from those that you're trying to impact. And I try to get out to the field when I can. Pre-COVID, it was easier. I guess a story that I think of is around our work in the fashion industry, where we've been working for many years on trying to strengthen labor rights of garment workers in places like Bangladesh. And you may know that Bangladesh is a country that will probably be underwater if we continue our current trajectory. And there is an individual in Bangladesh named Nazma Akhtar. She is actually a former child worker, was put to work when she was not even a preteen. And since then, she's become a real champion for workers' rights and now for climate-proofed jobs for workers, and has really helped to rally, you know, the millions of workers in Bangladesh around how can they understand their rights, be better able to negotiate for them, but also understand the impact and mitigate that impact of climate on their work and livelihoods.
Wow.
So super inspiring, and if anyone is working in Bangladesh, I'd be very happy to connect you to her.
Yeah, so that's really fascinating. So basically understanding how to build resilience about their future job in light of the physical risk of climate as well as, I suppose, economic.
Indeed, and empowering workers to understand those risks and be able to bring those risks to their employers, use that as part of their negotiation. This is all new. I mean, this is hot off the press. In fact, my team said, don't talk about it. It hasn't really happened yet. But I want to talk about it because the nexus of climate and inequality is there. And if we're talking about justice, we need to talk about how does this impact the most vulnerable populations, like a garment worker in Bangladesh.
And also a great example of what the empowerment of women does to the rest of the world. Andrew, an inspiring moment.
Well, what a great question. Thank you so much. We probably do 3/4 of our work in developing countries, but we do work in the United States. So let me give you a US story. You know, the great US federal government is now putting a lot of money to do good things at the local level. But one thing that actually doesn't happen is it doesn't get to poor areas. And the reason for that is you have to apply for the money and you have to know how to do it. And so we've been very engaged with the climate justice movement in the United States. Over the last 2 years, we put $300 million to support them. And what they do is really incredibly exciting. They are totally engaged at the local level, but they understand how resources get allocated. They then would fight in local councils, city councils. They would build capacity of those people in areas that are really disadvantaged, and they will pull in the resources. So a relatively small amount of money can actually shift the power structure within the entire decision-making process. And I must admit, when I first sort of started to learn about it, I didn't understand the power of empowering poor communities and what it can do, not only economically, not only for the environment, but actually psychologically and even for the nation as a whole. Now, there's a huge journey to go there, but it's an exciting one.
And the corollary to that point is how inconceivable it is to deploy, to conceive climate action without addressing the issue of poverty, I suppose, which that example illustrates.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, in a way, the beneficial effects for climate are almost byproducts of something that's at least as important, which is empowering local communities. And we see it so many places. I mean, another example that we are very heavily engaged in is the electrification of school buses. Well, what does that have to do with poor people? Well, just about everything. Because in the United States, there are 480,000 school buses. If you are a child in a poor county, and everything's done at the county level there, you will go to school on a diesel bus, breathing air that is more polluted than if you were standing on the street, sometimes in New Delhi. And the health effects of that are truly shocking. Now, if you electrify those buses, starting with the poor counties, you actually, the purpose is health and better life, but actually it also creates a group of children who learn about electrification at school. They talk to their parents about, you know, where we're going on environment. And in addition to that, those school buses during the long summer hot vacations, they actually are batteries that will save dozens of power plants being built because they take power off the grid when it's plentiful and they put it back on the grid. So you've got a whole set of issues, and by the way, you also help address climate change. But the climate change is almost sort of an incredibly wonderful byproduct of something that we absolutely need to do.
Well, this is such a great example. You were saying small money can do a lot as well as big money. And this example is the ripple effect of small action can be as big as big action. So there's nothing that prevents any of us to take small action, I think. And sometimes we prevent ourselves from taking action because they feel too small, but maybe not. So this leads me to my last question, which is, what are you intending to do here at COP? And basically, what do you want to achieve? What do you want to maybe hear, that conversation that are not yet happening, that you would like to hear? And what would good look like for you on the 18th of November, if you're still there by then?
All right, well, I'll kick this off. So I mean, personally, there's probably three things I'd like to do. And the first one is I would like to learn, and I think this kind of gets to a little bit in philanthropy. We're sometimes in our own little silo, but I want to hear from business and investors and civil society and activists and understand the complexity of these interrelated issues that we're trying to tackle systemically. So personally and selfishly, I want to learn, but hopefully that will help us be better as Laudes. I think secondly, I also think, I mean, it's great that philanthropy is showing up at COP, and I think every COP, it gets stronger and stronger. We have an event tomorrow where we're bringing philanthropic investors together to talk more about how do you accelerate the fair and just transition. There's more philanthropy can do, so I really want to do my bit to try to bring more investors along and inspire them to maybe up their ambition level as well around what we're doing. And maybe finally, we wouldn't do what we're doing if it weren't for our partners. So from a Laudes perspective, I mean, I want to amplify the voices of our partners. I think it's fantastic you're bringing indigenous groups here, Andrew. We don't actually have a lot of partners coming from Asia and Brazil and other areas we're working, and we probably should. So there's more we can do there. We have a lot of partners, mostly from Europe, doing a lot of policy work. Really want to do what we can to shine a light on their good work.
Great, thank you. Andrew?
Well, we are focusing on Africa a lot because this is Africa's COP. So on energy, a whole set of issues there, including decommissioning in South Africa, but equally or more important, bringing clean energy to a number of countries, working with them. On the nature side, as we talked about, restoration and conservation, focus on the Congo Basin for conservation. And I loved what you said, Leslie, about here to learn, because we also have we're new and we're still trying to figure out what our strategy should be. So for example, in food, we announced $1 billion for food transformation last year, but we still actually are landing on what it would be. And so we're going to spend a lot of time here talking with experts, trying to sort of really think through what should we do? How could we be most helpful? We don't want to just duplicate other people. We would love to sort of figure out exactly where those points are, where, Archimedes famously said, that if you give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum that is steady, I can move the world. And we all need to be asking, okay, where's our lever and where's our fulcrum and how do we sort of nip it in? But finally, it's not just about programs and where you allocate money. There is an intellectual battle going on at the moment, and so I think to some extent we very much want to be part of that. And it goes along the following lines. If you read the UNEP Gap report, it truthfully says we are failing miserably, and we need to embrace that. We need to hold that fear and that dread. If you look at the System Change Lab report, which came out last week, which is called The State of Climate Action, it looks at 40 of the transitions, and not a single one of them is on track. So on the one hand, we've got to hold that reality. But at the same time, we have got to understand how change takes place. And change takes place not in straight lines and smooth curves. Change takes place, as you were saying, Leslie, actually through a sudden kind of aha moment where you cross a tipping point and what in the United States is called a hockey stick. And what we need to do is really dig deep onto where these hockey sticks are, ask where they are, and in the next 12 months we've got to, as we come up to the stock take and so on, we've got to really ask the question, how are we going to push that across? Because the intellectual battle is precisely between sort of dread and hope. And we need to hold them both. And people here need neither to say we're going off a cliff like a bunch of lemmings, nor should they say we've sort of basically got it sorted. We've got to have a serious discussion as to what it would take, what you should do, what I should do, what they should do, and then come together and actually do it.
Grounded optimism.
Yes. That's right.
Well, thank you very much for this. I'd love to continue and to open up to the room, but I think we won't have time as the next session we're starting in 5 minutes. But I just really want to thank you to start us off like that. I think you've really contributed to us discovering our own aha moment, I think, with that conversation. And thank you for the work you do as well.
Thank you
so much.
Sophie. Thanks,
everyone.